Father, we ask all these things in Christ. Amen. All right, we're in 2 Timothy chapter 4, looking at the final word of Paul. And we notice at the beginning of the chapter, verses 1 through about 5, is his charge, his final charge to Timothy, his protege in the faith, his son in the faith, as he called him on several occasions. And giving him this final word of encouragement as he knows his time is near. And then last week we also looked at verses 6 through 8, which is really the climax of the book. Paul's declaration of victory in his own life. He said he was already being poured out as a drink offering. But he knew that his time here on earth was nearly gone, and that, but notice he had fought. I mean, we looked at all this imagery last week, probably in an athletic contest. He had fought the good fight. He had finished the race, the marathon of life, and he had kept the faith, and so therefore there was laid up for him not a royal diadem, but a Stephanos, a victor's crown, which Jesus would be standing there at the finish line ready to give him as he crossed it, as he would do for any Christian. He says, not to me only, but also to all who have loved his period. And so, very emotional and climactic end there. And then we get to this next section, which we started to get into, but really didn't get much. Verses 9 through 13. Just kind of a sad commentary, I guess, on Paul's, not only his circumstances, but sometimes on human nature. But he says, be diligent to come to me quickly. I think the King James says shortly, but literally there, make haste to come to me quickly is what he's saying in the Greek. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry, and Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Bring the cloak that I left for Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. And so we see this urgency in Paul's request, really for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, he doesn't know when his execution date is going to be. And so, obviously, if he tarries, if Timothy tarries, he may be too late. But also, you see down in verse 13, and we'll talk about this some more, he's without his cloak. He's without his outer garment. And winter is coming on, and that's not a good situation to be in a Roman dungeon without that. And so, a couple of reasons there. Paul hopes that Timothy can arrive sooner rather than later. For Demas has forsaken me. So we ask the question, what happened to all these other people? Paul's traveling companions that we saw throughout the book of Acts, some of them with him consistently. Demas is mentioned 3 times in Paul's letters. Obviously he was with Paul at some point in his first imprisonment, because in Philemon, which was one of those prison epistles written the first time he was in a Roman prison, he complimented Demas in Philemon verse 24 as a what? Fellow worker. So Demas gets a compliment several years earlier. It was probably about a 5-year time span in between these Roman imprisonments for Paul. But then you go over to Colossians chapter 4. Look over Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. First he's called a beloved or faithful worker, and then you get over to Colossians. Let's see. Verse 14. 4:14. Let's see what he says about Demas. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Well, Luke is the beloved physician, and Demas is what? No, he's not. Not in Colossians. What is Demas? He's just Demas. He's just Demas. Demas is just Demas. There's no hint of any compliment. There's kind of a, most commentators see kind of a stiffness or a distance there between Paul and Demas. So maybe Demas is already kind of pulling away a little bit by that time. But he doesn't get much of a mention. And then finally we see where he has forsaken Paul and Christ, for that matter, having what? Love this present world. And so we often talk about, it's often been mentioned that if you could go out in our communities and convert all the people that used to be members of the Lord's, faithful members of the Lord's church, you know, how full would our buildings be? You think of all the people you've known over the years that don't go to church anywhere or go into denominationalism or whatever. It's a staggering number. And why do they do that? That's probably pretty good commentary right there, having loved this present world. And so I don't know what Demas' particular problem was. Maybe he just got tired of the lifestyle. You know, if you hung out with Paul too long, things were not easy. But for whatever reason, he goes back into the pleasures of this world. Then he says, Crescens for... Well, I hadn't even got to that yet. You already asked me questions. I know, but I couldn't even get it out of my mouth when you asked me. Crescens for Galatia. Who is Crescens? Crescens. Question has been asked. Who is he? Anybody know? Because if you do, you know more than the rest of us. He's not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. So, obviously, though, he was of interest to who? No, not really Paul. I mean, I guess he was of interest to Paul, but who would he have been more interested in? What are we reading? This is not a trick question. What is an epistle?
A letter.
It's a letter. So who's obviously interested in Crescens? Timothy is, right. He's writing to Timothy. He says, hey, you want to know what Crescens is up to? Here's where he's at. I mean, it's obviously the reader of the letter is interested, or Paul wouldn't have been telling him, right? So, yeah, he says, he's headed for Galatia. Where's Galatia? Most of the time we associate that with southern Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, although some commentators have said the territory can also include Gaul. There's an area called Galatia. Well, where's Gaul for you Roman historians? Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, right? Yeah, southern France, northern Italy. And so there is an ancient tradition that indicates that this Crescens established several congregations in Gaul, but that's about all we know. It's from tradition. Nothing in the scriptures about him. And then he says Titus had gone to Dalmatia. Well, we're getting ready to study Titus, but Titus was written when? I mean, obviously this is the last letter that Paul wrote. So Titus was written before this. Well, where did Paul send Titus in that letter? He said, I left you where? In Crete. I left you in Crete to set some things in order there. So obviously Titus has already left Crete. Whatever work he did there, I guess, had concluded that assignment. And so he says he's headed for Dalmatia. And then he says, only Luke is with me. Well, we all know who Luke is, don't we? He's a doctor. He's also the only what? Writer of the New Testament. Gentile. He's the only Gentile writer that we know of, a non-Jewish writer of the New Testament. Also, of course, a first-rate historian, if you read the Gospel according to Luke and the book of Acts. He also wrote the longest book in the New Testament, right? Which one is the longest book in the New Testament? Luke. Luke's the longest book in the New Testament. I know you're going to say Matthew's got 28 chapters, Luke's got 24. It doesn't matter. Luke is the longest book in the New Testament, word-wise. Of course, we're familiar with the fact that Luke was a pretty regular traveling companion of Paul. How do we know that? How do I know? Yeah, you've got those passages in Acts that we refer to as the we passages, Acts chapter 16, chapter 20, chapter 27 through 28. So anytime you read the book of Acts and you get to those sections that say, we went here and we went there, then you know Luke was with Paul. And I also know that since he was with Paul at the end of the book of Acts, that he was with Paul during his first Roman imprisonment. Right? And now here he is again with him in his second Roman imprisonment. So I guess when you think about Luke, one word that comes to my mind to define this man is what? Loyalty. Yeah, loyalty. And I guess when we think about Paul's terrible circumstances here at the end of his life, I don't know who you would want to be with him more than a faithful Christian physician. He would have needed one in the circumstances that he found himself. But Paul, of course, is never one to dwell on his own issues. He's always thinking ahead, thinking about other people. And so he gives Timothy a command. He says, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me. He's beneficial. He's helpful to me for the ministry, for service. Who was Mark? John Mark. What was his, we know him from? I heard some mumbling in the back. Wait. You?
I was saying Barnabas is...
Yeah, he's Barnabas' cousin. We know him as Barnabas' cousin. And of course, he went with Paul and Barnabas on that first missionary journey until they got to where? Where did they get to before he turned around and went back? Yeah, Perga, Pamphylia. And so he turns around and leaves them. That didn't sit well with Paul. That reminds me of Brother Rice. You didn't do that to him either. You didn't go again with him. You did that. And that didn't sit well with Paul. So on the second, they get ready to leave on the second one, and Barnabas wants to take his cousin. Paul says, I don't care if he's your cousin or not. He's not going with me. Yeah. And they got into it. And, they had to part ways, which was fine. They're grown men. They take care of themselves.
Paul took Silas.
And so Paul takes Silas and Barnabas takes Mark. Now, approximately 20 years separates these two events. Probably. From the time that happened to this time here. So what does that tell me? What does it tell me from the fact that Paul says 20 years later, get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me. Yeah, it really tells me a couple things, probably. It tells me, number one, perhaps, that Mark has grown in his Christian faith and service, such that Paul now has confidence in him. It also could tell me something about Paul. That Paul's mellowed a little bit over 20 years. Not quite as tough on people as he used to be. And we generally become that way. The more we see of life and the more we see of people's circumstances. We can be pretty judgmental the younger we are. That's been my observation. But Paul says he's useful to me now. And then he says, he sent Tychicus to Ephesus. Well, we've seen Tychicus before. It appears that he probably conveyed the letters to the Ephesians and the Colossians, Ephesians 6 and Colossians 4. He was also in that company that took the collection from all the Gentile churches to the needy saints in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 20. And so it's interesting, though, when you read this, it says he sent Tychicus to Ephesus. So in our English Bibles, it looks like the only person with him is Luke. And Tychicus is gone. But a lot of the scholars that have written on 2 Timothy believe this is called an epistolary aorist. What does that mean? It means that Paul has written this letter most likely from the time frame of the audience, because many commentators believe that the person who took this letter to Ephesus, to Timothy, was probably who? Same guy that's always taking his letters, Tychicus. So it could be that when Paul writes this, that actually Tychicus is still there with him, but he's writing the letter as if once it gets there and they read it, he delivers it, he's reading it from that time frame, okay, or he's writing it from that point of view. Tychicus I've sent to Ephesus. He sent the letter with it. So now, by the time they read it, he is in Ephesus. He's not with him anymore. So that's a possibility. Wrote it in anticipation of his departure. And these next sections are pretty interesting stuff. You know, a lot of critics of the Bible will look at details like this and say, well, what's all that about? Why is that important? But it really is interesting when he, verse 13, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas when you come, and the books, especially the parchments. Well, this cloak was a cape of heavy material, probably wool, but sometimes leather with a slot in the top of it. It's kind of like a Mexican serape or something. And of course it was used in cold and rainy weather, and at night they used it for a blanket. So, let's get the scene here. This is how, I mean, you know, we live a pretty easy life, and sometimes we think if things don't go our way, that somehow we're not in God's favor if life isn't going well. So, you think in your mind, other than Jesus Christ, who is the greatest figure in the New Testament? Who is the most faithful Christian you can think of in your mind? Ever. Yeah, this guy right here. So here he is. He's in the worst possible, we talked about Roman dungeons. He's in the worst possible condition. In prison, simply for preaching. And he has nothing, not even his outer garment. And winter is coming. And he says, I really would like you to get here before it gets much colder. Now that's the state Paul finds himself in. When we moan and say, oh, I must be doing something wrong, things aren't going my way. I don't see Paul saying that. And we'll make some interesting observations about that. Number one, why did he leave his cloak in Troas? Anybody ever thought about that? There are a lot of possibilities. I like one commentator suggested, was he in a hurry to get away from the authorities? Did they catch him in Troas? Is that where he was arrested? I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. But again, it is a commentary on Paul's sacrificial poverty. And then you have to ask yourself too, only Luke is with him. Now, does anybody remember how Paul was greeted when that first Roman imprisonment in the book of Acts? Remember that? As he approached the city? What does it say happened?
People came out to meet him.
Oh, all those Christians came out to meet him, right? Well, ask yourself then, where are they at? Where are all those folks at? Maybe. This is also 2 years into the Neronian persecution.
They may be dead.
They may be dead, maybe scattered to the winds. Everybody that could took off, left Rome. I don't know. Maybe they did forsake him. I don't know. But you sometimes have to ask, where were they? And we'll talk about that when we get down to verse 16. What is does this passage tell us about Paul's fortitude and independence? Where's the whimpering? Where's the whining? Where's the complaining? We talk about millennials and our country now. I was watching politicians last night. They couldn't promise enough on the campaign trail already for the presidency next year. I saw Bernie Sanders telling all the students how, they shouldn't have to pay back their student loans. We'll just give it to you. No complaining or whimpering by Paul. No browbeating of the brethren who weren't there for him. No begging. I was reading a book this week. I like what this guy said. He said, Jesus is our Lord and Savior. He's not our nursemaid. He came to deal with our sin, not wipe our noses. You ever thought about that? Anybody thinks they become a Christian, life's just going to be, the yellow brick road? Never promised that. I mean, we go through the same things other people do. How many of you in here have had surgery? How many have had cancer? How many use a walker? How many have lost loved ones? Is your life any different in that sense than anybody else's in this world? No. So, but our attitude ought to be different from the world's. Like Paul's. No complaining, no whining. No tearing into other people because they didn't fulfill their responsibilities to him. I'll tell you what else this tells us, that God cares. It tells me that the Lord is interested in the most intimate and intricate details of my life. I can talk to him, I can go to prayer to him and say, I am having a tough time, and I need some help. I need some strength. Nothing wrong with that. But he does care about us. He cared about Paul, and he cared about Paul's circumstances. But he didn't miraculously pick him up and pull him out of prison and say, I'm sorry, things are going so bad. So we're not exempt from the common distresses of life, even if we're faithful. Did Paul expect the Lord to give him a supernatural heat source? Did Paul believe in God's providence? Sure he did. And yet, what's he doing? Paul didn't believe that providence meant that he didn't have to do anything. I mean, what's Paul doing? He's looking out for, he's writing a letter telling somebody, bring me my coat. He's taking things in, he's doing his part. Faith without the appropriate response from us produces nothing. And so, yes, Paul would say, I believe in the providence of God, but I got something to do here. I can write and ask for my coat. I'm just going to sit here hoping that, something miraculous happens. Then he says, when you come, bring those books, and especially the parchments. That word for books is biblia, or biblion, from which we get our word Bible. And it refers to papyrus scrolls or rolls. But it's a comprehensive term. It could designate one of the Old Testament writings. Jesus read from what when he was at Nazareth in the synagogue? What does it say he read from? The scroll, the book. It was a papyrus scroll. But Jesus also used this same word to designate a divorce decree in Matthew 19, verse 7. So it could refer to literary or legal documents. Anything written on this particular plant. The Greek word for parchment, he says, bring me the books, especially the parchments. That is membranous or membrana, which means what? Skins. These are animal skins. Sometimes when you're reading about how we got the Bible, you read the word vellum. Scriptures were written on papyrus rolls or vellum. Vellum's animal skins. That's what he's talking about here. The books, the papyrus rolls or scrolls, and the animal skins, the vellum, the parchments. They were more expensive than the papyrus. And so commentators read this differently. Some think these are two different categories of articles. Some think that one's just more specific than the other ones. He's saying like, okay, bring the books. And what I mean by that is bring me the parchments. I don't know. Could be two separate things. But here's the question. The real question is, what were these documents? There's all kinds, there's about 4 different ideas thrown out there about what these were, or what they contained or didn't contain. What do you think? What could these things have been? What are some possibilities?
The writings of the prophets.
Okay, yeah, could have been the Old Testament scriptures. That's one possibility. You could have said, look, bring me those copies of the Old Testament that I have. I want to study those. That is one possibility. Yeah, could have been letters from other people. Could have been his own letters. Could have been copies of his own letters, epistles he'd already written. Right? What else? A couple more possibilities.
They could be blank.
They could be blank. He could be saying, bring me my writing materials. I got more writing to do. Absolutely. I got more letters to write. I want to encourage more people. So certainly that's a possibility. The fourth possibility that's sometimes given, considering his circumstances, is there could have been some legal documents in there. Like, what about his Roman citizenship papers or something of that nature? I mean, he's already had apparently some preliminary hearings. Maybe he needs something like that. So there's a lot of possibilities. And you can't be dogmatic about it, but it's all pretty interesting. And then we have this reference, of course, to Carpus, only mentioned here in the New Testament. But obviously he had some confidence in Carpus. He left him his outer garment and these books, these scrolls and these animal skins. And so we don't know much about him, but obviously Paul had some confidence in him. So just another faithful brother that we don't know a whole lot about. Interesting stuff when you think about Paul's life and where he finds himself at this point. Any questions or comments? Let's keep going. Verse 14. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works or his deeds. You also must be aware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. At my first defense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. That kind of reminds me of who? Who does that remind me of? Christ. Remember who was on the cross? Also reminds me of who else? Stephen. Yeah. But the Lord stood with me. Those people didn't, but he did. And strengthened me. So here's a guy under terrible circumstances in prison, cold, living in the dark probably in his own human filth, disease. And he says, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me and that all the Gentiles might hear. Also I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. The Lord will deliver me from every evil work and preserve me for his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Well, Alexander the coppersmith, it's hard to identify him with precision, although that name is used a few times in the New Testament. He's warning Timothy about him, so that probably tells me that this guy lives where?
In Rome.
Thank you. I've been studying these books now for weeks. Where is Timothy? He's in Ephesus, right?
Okay.
So he's warning him about Alexander, so he's probably in Ephesus. Some identify him with the Alexander that's mentioned in Acts 19:33. There's also 1 Timothy chapter 1. But again, it's a pretty common name, so it's hard to know. But he said he did him a lot of evil, harm really from an evil heart. We don't really know what that was, but enough that Paul remembered it. And it's interesting. May the Lord repay him according to his deeds. Well, who's going to repay him? Who's the Lord here? And who's he been talking about as our judge? Christ, right? Going to be Christ, and may he render him. In the NASB that says repay. That's what it means. Render means to repay, and that's what the New King James says. May he repay him. Paul was a believer in divine justice, not in karma. Karma is the idea that you're going to get it when. It's kind of now, right? You know, you do something bad today, and something bad happens to you tomorrow, well, that's karma. It's not the way the world works, by the way. Evil people live all the time without a lot of problems. They do a lot of bad things. They may never pay for them, ever. They might not. Job was smart enough to know that. His friend said, "Oh, you've sinned." Bad people, when they sin, bad things happen. Job says, "No, that's not right. I can look around me. I see evil people living it up all the time." What was the guy, Psalm 73? Is that Asaph? Who said, you know, man, the evil got it easy. Now, I understood their end. They don't always get it here. But Paul believed that one day there's a day of justice and judgment coming. And so it also tells me what's going to be taken into account on Judgment Day. Let him repay him according to his works, his deeds. A lot of religious people that live in this world and act like I can live however I want to and do whatever I want to. And that's just not what the Bible teaches. Yeah.
Well, I have believed for a long time one's going to reap what they sow. Not necessarily in this life, but in the life to come. But I also think one will be repaid in this life likewise. And if not in this life, certainly in the life to come. But most of us want to do the repaying ourselves.
Yeah.
We can't wait on the Lord. That takes too long.
Yeah, and the problem with that, of course, is Romans chapter 13 and chapter 16 are pretty clear that the only people that he's given the authority to do that here is the government. We're not to be vigilantes, avengers of our own people that hurt us in some way. And he says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. So for Christians, if you believe God and if you believe in a final judgment, then when we take matters into our own hands, take out our own personal vengeance on people, in effect what we have done is what? We usurp the authority of God. We've said, God has said, I have reserved that for myself. And I've said, well, that's too bad, I'm going to do it. And so I have stepped into his shoes and taken his authority. And if there's one thing I know, I can read this book cover to cover. And there's one thing that I know when it gets down to it, the one thing of all the sins that I see in the Bible that God deals with, the one that he deals with the harshest and the quickest is to disrespect his authority. You know, people have problems. People commit sins of the flesh because they're weak. People forsook Paul And Christ, when he was on this earth, and God, even in the Old Testament, seemed to have I don't know, I just say patience with people. I mean, he knows our frailties. The psalmist says he knows our frame, that we are what? That we're dust. And he seems to have more patience with sins that deal with human weakness than he does with defiance of his authority. And when we set ourselves up as his authority, as our own authority, and we disregard his, I mean, ask Moses. Ask Moses what it meant to him to disregard the authority of God. So look at those people when God told him to speak to that rock, and he struck that rock, and he said, you know, do I have to do everything for you? And to fail to give God the glory that he deserved and the credit. I mean, you know, that's a pretty heavy price for that. And so, we have to be careful.
Great.
Yeah.
Was it Psalm 139 where David said, keep me from presumptuous sin?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that what that would be?
I mean, I look at the life of David and Saul. I mean, there's a good example. You mentioned David. I look at David and Saul. And David took another man's wife, committed adultery, and then had him what? Murdered. And most Christians would look at that and say, man, that's terrible. It is terrible. But they look at Saul and say, well, what about what Saul did? Did Saul do that? I don't read anything about sexual sins in Saul's life. I don't know. Maybe he had some, but I don't read anything about that. What did Saul do? Did he commit adultery? Did he murder somebody? No, God just said, go kill the Amalekites. Kill them all. And Saul said, no, I don't think I'll do it that way. I think I'll change God's orders. And Samuel said, you don't understand. You don't usurp God's authority. You don't defy his authority. And the religious world in general says, you know, we don't have to have authority for what we do. We can just do it however we want to do it. And we have to be careful about that. I'm telling you, authority is a big deal with him. And when we disregard the authorities that he set in place, it's a big deal with him. I mean, nobody has respect for authority anymore, government or otherwise. And yet, he says in Romans 13, I'm the one that's behind that authority. So, you need to be careful. But, he said he would be judged according to his deeds or his works. And Timothy, you be aware of him. You be on guard. You watch out because he resisted our words. And there's a couple of different ways commentators look at that, these words. In fact, I think the New American Standard says he vigorously opposed our teaching. So some commentators believe he's talking about here his teaching, the doctrine. Others think, well, you know, that the words refer to the gospel message. Others believe, well, maybe when he says he resisted our words, maybe Alexander maybe he actually showed up at some of these hearings and testified against Paul. I don't know. Maybe just withstood him in some public forum fashion. I don't know. Could involve both. But he resisted Paul's words.
Paul's teaching hurt for Alexander Central.
If it's the same Alexander. Yeah. If it's the same Alexander, yeah, his teaching did hurt. If it's the same Alexander from Acts 19, then yes, that is correct. Although you can't be positive, that certainly is a possibility. But yeah, I would tend to incline that he resisted the gospel message, his teaching. Yeah.
Perhaps Alexander might fit into that level of being more received.
It could be. you know, if it's, and again, since we don't know what Alexander it is, and it was a pretty common name, you know, maybe he was a member of the church there that, you know, that Timothy was going to have to continue to deal with in Ephesus. I don't know. Then you have this sad statement, at his first defense, no one stood with him, but all forsook him. May not be charged against him. Well, that's kind of an interesting statement. Most commentators think, well, it doesn't have, it's not the first Roman imprisonment that he's talking about. This first defense. By the way, what's the word for defense there? Yeah, apologia, which we get our word apologetics. You know, we use the word apology, the English word apology, to say I'm sorry. That's what we mean. That's not what it meant in the Greek in that day and age. An apology was a defense. So he said, at his first defense, no one stood with him. And so most commentators believe perhaps this is some preliminary hearing in connection with the current imprisonment. Doesn't have anything to do with the first one. And nobody was willing to stand with him. And I don't know, maybe like we said, a lot of them have been scattered, a lot of them have been martyred. But look at Paul's attitude. What was his attitude? May it not be... Yeah, charged against them or laid to their account. That word for account is a commercial term meaning to place on one's record, obviously referring to the final judgment. So again, it kind of gets me back around to this idea of, I mean, here's Paul on one hand saying, may the Lord repay him for what he did, but for these people, I want the Lord to be merciful. And so there's something about this weakness that these people had that Paul said, you know, I think the Lord knows these people's hearts. And maybe they had a moment of weakness, but hopefully, you know, there's a place for that. Yeah.
Greg, I think sometimes people do things out of ignorance and don't really know any better. I think Paul, notwithstanding, in that case, sometimes he thought he was doing it out of good conscience.
Well, obviously, Alexander did something purposefully.
Right.
These people, look, none of us knows how we would react in those circumstances.
Right.
You know, all of a sudden you're thrown out there and some guy says, well, look at Peter. Peter's standing around the fire, and next thing you know, they're pointing fingers at him.
You were with him.
You're with him.
Yeah.
No, I'm not. You know, that's just the first thing that comes out of his mouth. So, it's a little bit different circumstance than somebody like Alexander. Paul said.
I like what Brother Bailey said. One doesn't know how strong you are. We don't know how strong the big oak is until the wind comes.
Yep, that's right. But I'll tell you what I do know. The bell. We're going to finish 2 Timothy next week. Start Titus.